Hey guys, welcome back to Genshin Interact. Today we're going to be talking about Overload and just the entire idea behind the reaction and what maybe future characters are going to change about it, as well as what it kind of looked like in the past. So the first thing we kind of want to talk about was what it did look like at the beginning of the game and previous of how the Overload reaction really was. At least from when I started, I played since day one. At that point in time, there wasn't really a lot of different reactions, necessarily as many as there are now, just because of the Dendro reaction, creating some more reactions that were kind of cool. But back then, you kind of had some certain elements and certain things and reactions that were doing better than others, and personally, I really liked the Overload reaction. Problem being is that it didn't necessarily enhance personal damage or whatsoever, and it really wasn't that great to really go on after, which was kind of the little bit of the hit to kind of go on with Overload in the beginning of the game. Looking at some other characters that as time kind of went on though, looking as they kind of developed into different characters, we had, D-Luke at the beginning as well, and, really kind of pairing him with my personal idea with it was pairing him with Lisa. It helped a lot to make the reaction usable, but it still wasn't that great, and it was a little bit difficult to constantly make sure the reaction was happening. As time went on, Fisher was there as well, really helping the reaction to be a little bit more applicable, but then we go into a leeway, and we started to get a lot of different characters that could maybe make it a little bit easier to use. Getting characters like Beto and getting characters like Yanfei even, as time was going to go on in the future as well. Looking at all these different characters that Leeway really tried to bring, and having characters like Bennett still from Mondstadt made the reaction very nice to use, and it was kind of cool necessarily to have, but nobody was really using it as a main way of a team Overload being the team, damage. This is how the meta is supposed to play or whatever. It really wasn't usable. And it really kind of felt the same as, a Geo kind of felt when it, started to come out with Zhongli. It was out before that, but, it was just a very almost quote-unquote useless element. And as we're kind of seeing with Navia making these changes now, it's kind of thinking about how could characters in the future in Fontaine change this Overload reaction. With how Navia changed Geo, quote-unquote changed Geo, how can, maybe some characters in the future change a little bit more about the Overload reaction?
Yeah, for sure. And to bounce off of that, how you were talking about these early characters, Pyro and Electro characters. I know you told me when I first got in the game that you really liked using D-Luke and Beto together, with that off-field Beto with the on-field D-Luke, and even Raiden for her skill. There were definitely a lot of fun to use Overload teams well before Fontaine, and even well before Sumeru. There were options there, and I know a lot of people use that kind of thing, and it was definitely viable. It's just not something people would actually bring into an Abyss setting, because like you're saying, there's not a lot of synergy there. But with Chevreuse coming out here in a few weeks, maybe there's going to be a lot of fixes to the elements of Pyro and Electro's reaction Overload, and maybe there will be some actually viable endgame teams to build with for the Abyss. And, you were actually showing me something about Chevreuse with her constellations. They had a recent change with her Constellation 2, where when her burst or her skill does some damage and causes an Overload reaction, it will actually kind of create a knockback effect towards the character instead of away from, like all other Overload reactions typically do. And the analogy that it was made to was kind of like Yelan's skill, where Yelan's skill actually pulls in enemies towards the attacker. And so looking at Chevreuse in her C2, it might have a very similar effect to that. And when I was looking at that, thought, that might be a definite fix to a potential problem that I even thought of and other people would bring up. Well, with Overload's knockback effect, is that going to be a problem that hinders certain teams? Even with Chevreuse buffing capabilities, there's just natural problems you'd run into, like when Catching does a charged attack, she tends to jump backwards, and other characters, just the immense amount of knockback, just making the team not necessarily more difficult to play, or hindering damage. It just becomes more annoying to play because you're throwing around enemies and then you can't use them, especially if you don't have an Animo character in there, stuff like that. I mean, Yoimiya might get a lot of use out of this, even putting aside that knockback effect that Chevreuse would bring to the table in her Constellation 2, just because she's a ranged character, and some others like that, maybe Yanfei, and a few others that I'm just not thinking of right now. But for sake of the illustration, that they definitely wouldn't have a drawback there just because they are ranged characters. I don't know what's your take on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, when we were talking about this originally, I brought up Yanfei and Yoimiya purposefully, because the idea behind them is that ranged characters are going to be kind of good, especially with the overload reaction, because like you were talking about, knockback is a little bit of an annoyance, and it's even more annoying to think of something with like a Bennett burst being down or a field that you want to stay
For
inside of
sure.
to get a buff. Having the knockback constantly just knock smaller enemies, because you don't really have to
Yeah.
worry about that for big enemies, and sometimes they don't even get staggered by it. But the idea is that, you're just knocking them out of the zone, which is bringing down your damage. The overload reaction itself isn't necessarily buffing your personal character's damage anyways. It's really only based on, elemental mastery and level, which is kind of the problem. It's kind of like Hyperbloom, it's just based on level and the elemental mastery, and, just necessarily just that's it,
Yeah,
and so.
yeah, that's kind of the other thing too. I think a lot of people, even now and even after Chevreuse, I think it's going to be a misconception by a lot of people that the overload damage is scaling off the character's attack or maybe their pyro or electro damage bonus based on who's doing it, which I will go ahead and say it doesn't, because it's its own little damage number. And you will notice that even in gameplay, when you cause an overload reaction, it's its own separate number that pops up. And it just reminds me of Bloom, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon, the way they kind of work. They're also their own separate numbers that are influenced by very different means from the other normal reactions in the game, like Vaporize, you name it. So I think Overload's the same exact way. And it's been in the game this whole time, and it works a lot more like that, where it's just the elemental mastery and the character level. So with that being said, I definitely think that's going to be something important to kind of, think of when you're building these overload designated teams, when you're building your Chevreuse, when you're building all these characters around Chevreuse maybe. Who knows, maybe elemental mastery on Chevreuse would actually be a thing you might want to do, especially if you're doing a damage Chevreuse versus a support Chevreuse, because I know that'll definitely be something, two different ways people are going to go about building her. So I think it's definitely interesting to think about how some current builds or current best builds on some older characters like Diluc using Crimson Witch, that's usually a go-to, seeing how that could change to an overload build, which Crimson actually does help in and of itself as well. So I think that gives it some versatility there as well.
I think it's just a lot of things are going to be kind of changing with it, because I really like how they made Chevreuse. They didn't just get the idea across that they were only going to be trying to help overload. They understood the idea, like you were talking about, that your pyro damage bonus, your electro damage bonus is going to be a separate number. Your initial hit on top of the overload reaction, let's just say you have a Raiden burst, right? And you've already got a pyro applied to the character, and you have already had, let's say for instance, Chevreuse create an overload reaction previously. You now have this buff or whatever, and there's pyro now once again still activated on this poor little Hilichurl that's in front of you, and you pop a Raiden burst. Your electro hit is going to be the same as if you did a normal electro hit. There's going to be no difference. It's just going to have an added number, an overloaded reaction number, right, on top of that. And that's just to give across the idea, I think, in the game, is like it's an extra explosion. Like that's the explosion damage.
Yeah, it's kind of like additive damage.
Right. So I think it's the idea of like you have your original hit, and then there's like an explosion that occurs afterwards. And so that's maybe the great thing that might be, oh, okay, well, this is cool. But what MiHoYo did that I'm kind of glad for is that they put in Chevreuse's kit, especially with her constellations and whatnot, bringing resistance down of enemies with Pyro or Electro. They're bringing their Pyro and Electro resistance down, or bumping up Pyro and Electro damage bonus of characters in the party, so that you could actually do more damage, base damage, with the character that you're creating that reaction with after Chevreuse, so you can make sure to constantly be there. Going back to what you were talking about earlier about like how having characters just constantly apply, once again going into Raiden and Yoimiya, if you have that constant reaction happening, even if Chevreuse is creating that overload reaction, which is great and that's what you want, at the same time you kind of want your on-fielders to be creating that as well. And, yeah, building them high EM or whatever is probably not going to be your best bet. It's still probably best to build them normal full damage route. But building Chevreuse a certain specific way might actually help a lot of changes to how Overload can actually be used. And, we've talked a lot about the past, how characters like Kuki and Beidou and all these different characters that are a little bit different with Yanfei and Yoimiya, some range stuff, and especially with characters like Raiden with her skill, probably pairing really, really well with someone like Yoimiya. That's great to constantly create this reaction, but my thing is I'm thinking about some future characters. We've talked about the past, we're talking about right now, about, if Chevreuse, the time period of right now, Chevreuse coming out in a few weeks, how that might be a great, change to how we're going to be looking at it. But looking at some other characters, for instance, like Arlecchino or Clauron, I really think that these two characters, at first, I thought Arlecchino was going to be our overload character. On-field, pyro damage dealer, that's what you're going to DPS is going to be, and that's what her kind of role is going to fit like. But as time kind of goes on, I've kind of sensed, at least through the story and some background stuff that's kind of been going on, I don't think that Arlecchino's going to be kind of like that. I think she's going to be she's going to have her own little quirk about her kit, and, we put that in a leaks video or a discussion video we were talking about in our Interact post. So we've already been talking about that, so I don't want to say that here, but someone like Clauron in the future, there is no leak or no backing speculation whatsoever to this, it's just my own personal thoughts. We see her in gameplay using Iron Sting, which is an elemental mastery sword. Which makes me think that it's another Electro character, so she's going to be an Electro character. We've kind of already seen that in story as well. That if she uses an Elemental Mastery Sword, other characters use like Dull Blade or Bloodstained Greatsword, like 3-star, 1-star, whatever weapons normally in the normal fight scenes or whatever that we see in Genshin. So for her to be showing Iron Sting, to me is a little bit of a tip-off that she might be overload heavy to actually be useful for this reaction.
It's definitely a hint at like what's to come, and maybe it's promoting elemental mastery on Clauron. And even if that's not for overload, one thing that came to my mind as you were talking about Clauron was if she's naturally going to be great to build for overload, which implies you're building elemental mastery, that means outside of her overload niche, let's just say, she'll still be very decent for aggravate teams specifically, because she'll have a high elemental mastery. Granted, you will have a high attack as just a good electro DPS, so she'll probably be a good option for a lot of players to go either aggravate or overload. Kind of like an upgraded version of catching is what I had in my mind. So that's just my thought on that, but I do agree with you on where Arlecchino and Clauron might be in terms of their team builds, so I definitely agree with you on that.
I think it's going to be kind of cool to see what Overload's going to do in the future. I think at the same time, there's a lot of thoughts behind what future characters are going to do, how past characters, especially with a lot of the reactions and the changes that we've been getting. There's kind of an idea across what's been kind of going on in our minds about certain characters. For instance, Kuki got really, really good with Hyperbloom. Toma got really, really good because of Burgeon. Both of these characters, in Inazuma before Dendro hit, very lacking characters that really just didn't have a real place in the game that people are going to be consistently using them. And now all of a sudden, it's these great characters that you should have in your account, and a 4-star that's almost necessary in your account to have. And for instance, Fischl, I think a lot of people have always used Fischl, but I think once again, because of the Electro reaction, because of maybe aggravate and spread and stuff like that, I think having her as a 4-star option to Yae Miko is a great thing as well to have, that I think a lot of people are looking into. So as the game changes, we tend to only focus on new characters and what can be new for everything that's happening in the future, and that's great to look at. But I'm really excited to also see how in-game already done characters now could also possibly change, and look at how the differences could be for that as well.
Oh yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I actually, to the point where I really am for that, especially for newer players. Sometimes they may get the idea that they have to always be looking at these new characters. It's like, well, I don't have this new character, so I feel under-leveled, or I feel underpowered. It's like, well, that's not necessarily, that doesn't have to be the case. You know what I'm saying? Like, all these old 4-stars, and you've probably heard it at this point, unless you're extremely new to Genshin. People talk about how the OG 4-stars are just busted. They just are. They're really, really powerful for being a 4-star. People still talk about Xiangling being just incredible. Fischl, Xingqiu, they're at the top of the 4-star tier list for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. And, obviously can't forget about Bennett either as being probably the quote-unquote...
Oh, well, he's not a 4-star. He's a 6-star.
He's a 6-star, exactly. So that's the whole point. But yeah, anyways, that's really all we had to bring today. We just wanted to kind of talk about the Overload reaction, kind of some different changes, and maybe just some different types of videos that are going to be a little bit more kind of just us talking about the game, not necessarily having to format into specific series that we've kind of been doing. And we've seen that that's been working, but we're also trying to just see how these types of videos are working. So let us do know in the comments if you guys like what we have been putting out. But besides that, we'll see you in the next one.